From courtside of the virtual hardwood, it's the NLSC Podcast, a weekly show for basketball gamers and hardcore hoopheads. And with you once again, I'm joined as always by my co-host Derek, aka D for 3. Derek, basketball discourse often comes back to numbers, and last week, hoopheads got a new number to talk about. We certainly have some thoughts about it, so please, tip us off.
So our main topic for this week's show is in part a discussion about Bam Adebayo's 83-point game, but also about an important broader topic. When is a record or performance legitimate? So Andrew, I'm going to go on a rant here. Bam Adebayo scored 83 points on March 10th, 2026 versus the tanking Washington Wizards, who went into that game 16-47 and hungry to lose more. Adebayo shot 20 for 43 from the floor, 7 for 22 from 3, and 36 for 43 from the free throw line. It's a record number of attempts and makes from the line. He shot 10 for 27 from the floor, though, Andrew, after the first quarter, a dreadful percentage, which included air balls and chucking from anywhere and everywhere. Furthermore, towards the end of the game, the Heat and Bam were feverishly going for more, while being up close to 30 points, including fouling the Wizards in order to get more possessions, and a Heat player intentionally missing a free throw off the front of the rim in order to get Bam an extra possession. And it's also worth noting the Wizards had some suspect fouls in this one, fouling Bam pretty far away from the hoop. So here is my take on this. Any record that isn't within the flow of the game, that isn't executed during true competition or in good faith, and any record that heavily compromises the integrity of the game, not only has an asterisk, but I will never consider it a real record. The outcry related to this game was incredibly negative, and it wasn't just because it was Bam Adebayo, someone who isn't an incredibly skilled scorer doing it. It had to do with many factors, with the way the points were scored being the number one driving point to the negativity. It was constantly mentioned that the way he was scoring that many points was far from organic, that it was stat chasing and stat padding against an absolutely terrible team that was trying to lose anyway, which, by the way, Spoelstra even said in an interview after the game that he knew the Wizards were trying to lose. That in itself is terrible for basketball. But it's also because he was kept in during a massive blowout, and the majority of his points in the game, which was after the first quarter, were scored with a terrible shooting percentage well below league average, a record-setting free throw count, and suspect behavior by himself, his coaching staff, and his teammates. I said it in the Discord and I will say it here. Because of the fouling while being up big and a Heat player intentionally missing a free throw, the Heat should have been fined for not acting within the confines of the game and not acting within confines of the competition. Kobe's 81-point performance was referenced many times on social media as well, but was not the number one driver of negativity towards this performance. I was around for Kobe's 81, and while social media was certainly not what it is today, Kobe's performance was celebrated by the large majority, the exact opposite of this situation. He did not get that 81 against a great team, but the large majority of the action was executed via true competition. It didn't break the integrity of the game. Kobe and the Lakers had to come back from 18 down in that one, and were up by 17 with 4 minutes to go. People, most who have an agenda or don't know basketball, were saying that Kobe should have been taken out with 4 minutes to go with that 17-point lead. It is rare for coaches to rip starters when up by under 20 in the final 4 or 5 minutes of a game. There is still time for a comeback at that point, and the Toronto Raptors were trying still. Furthermore, Kobe looked unstoppable, putting up a plethora of different shots and shooting a far better percentage than Bam, including 28 for 46 from the floor, 7 for 13 from downtown, while shooting 18 for 20 from the line in 42 minutes. All of those percentages well above league average. So again, the outcry of negativity related to Bam's performance, which was the majority of the response, is a major red flag. It's once again a terrible look for the NBA and the current state of basketball, and is just another stain on Adam Silver's NBA resume. If it was an organic performance that dazzled, the reception would have been positive. It seems that half the NBA teams are tanking, Andrew, which means intentionally losing, producing some of the worst basketball imaginable. Stats are incredibly inflated in general over the last few years, and this is just another case of that. What the NBA ownership thinks fans want, what they call entertainment, which is rules that favor the offense, high-scoring games regardless of quality, and basketball that is more about fit and style than true competition, is not what people want when it comes to sports. I also wanted to bring up that there are hundreds, if not thousands, more impressive performances than Bam's in basketball history. Games where teams were going at it hard, and there were monster performances, whether it be regular season or playoffs. You know, the Bird-Neek duel, KG versus Dirk in the playoffs, Barkley's 56 versus the Warriors, Curry versus the Thunder in the regular season with his incredibly deep three that won it, Jordan's 69 versus the Cavs, Magic Johnson starting at center in the finals and leading his team to victory. There are countless performances that mean more, that were done organically, that were just absolutely spectacular performances that blow away this Bam performance. And lastly, before I throw it over to you, the whole 83 is 83 is a comment that really gets to me because it's disregarding the most important thing when it comes to an achievement, the most important thing when it comes to sport, and that is context. After the first quarter, Bam was not impressive. He was the opposite, meaning 3/4 of the game was chucking and going to the line and stat padding against a team that is trying to lose, an embarrassingly bad basketball team. In my opinion, people should expect more and hold these players, teams, and honestly the league to a higher standard because the league is not in a great state, and this game further proves it.
I mean, I 100% agree. Is it legit in so much as he played within the rules, he scored 83 points, 83 points went up on the board, it's in the box score, it's official, sure, but we have seen this in recent years, and we've talked at length about Devin Booker before, and other players who padded their final total in a game that was over, already decided, and it does feel cheap. It doesn't feel sporting. It's always going to feel a bit cheap when teams and players do that. And look, referring back to Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game, it's been well documented that there was a bit of chicanery going on towards the end of that game. Him getting triple-teamed, fouled, the Warriors fouling to get him the ball back, etc. And that's often been brought up when talking about Wilt's 100-point game. And that's significant, Derek, because a lot of people say, oh, nobody will care about the context, nobody will care about the how in a couple of years' time. Well, over 60 years later, people are talking about how Wilt's 100-point game did have a bit of chicanery towards the end. So...
Oh, well, I want to point out, absolutely. Here's the point, too. It's not a whole, people have padded before. I hate that blanket statement. People have stat padded before. There have been performances that were similar to this. Right. That's exactly right. So Wilt Chamberlain, the biggest knock on that performance is that we've never seen it, actually, right? There's no footage of it. If you actually look on social media,
that too, yeah.
The biggest outcry is, where's the footage? We have all of this footage from back then. Where's this footage from this Wilt performance? But yes, if they were doing that in order for him to get to 100, and it wasn't done through true competition, and there was stat padding and that type of stuff going on, then I look at that record in a similar way. Right? And the same thing with Devin Booker, who scored 70 versus the Celtics. I watched that game live. First off, the Suns lost that game, but just the way that took place, that didn't look organic at all. It looked ridiculous. It didn't look like true competition. There are, again, hundreds and thousands better performances on a basketball floor in the NBA and otherwise than that performance by Devin Booker. This isn't a, two wrongs make a right situation.
Yeah.
That's never a thing. That's never real. That's just a bunch of noise, and it's not attacking the true issue.
And I do think that Wilt's record is looked at a little bit differently. Obviously, 100 points being triple digits, a big deal. It's also the early days of professional basketball, of the NBA. It was a time when the NBA was still competing with college basketball for popularity. So it was a big event. It's a landmark event in NBA history. So it does get looked at slightly differently. And of course, the Knicks weren't tanking back in 1962, trying to lose that game. Wilt and the Warriors were just dominating them. And then he padded the stats a little bit in the final minutes to get to the 100 points. So there are some differences. Again, context is important. But yeah, I don't enjoy stat padding like this. It does feel very manufactured. It doesn't feel sporting. And I know there's always debate about, should teams take their foot off the pedal? Should they not run up the score? Should they dribble out the clock at the end of games? And there are differing opinions there. And that is a separate discussion, obviously, but I do think if a team has raised the white flag with less than 24 seconds left in the game, if you are winning, then yes, dribble out the clock. Of course, if the team that's losing still wants to compete, that's a different story, I suppose, but I do think sportsmanship is important. And look, I'm not going to say this is a stain on the NBA like the Malice of the Palace, or incidents like that. But it is hard for me to enjoy these performances that don't feel organic. And of course, what does it say about the current NBA, the supposed evolved NBA, defenses better than ever, the most skilled and smart players ever, can't stop a player whose career average is 16.1 points per game from scoring 83 points. It doesn't say much for current defenses, certainly doesn't say much for how competitive the league is at the moment. And we talked about tanking a couple of episodes ago. Obviously a huge problem. And people will compare it to these other performances. David Thompson and George Gervin going head-to-head for the scoring title. That's different. Something's on the line there. The scoring title is not necessarily the most important title in the NBA. That would be the Larry O'Brien Trophy, of course. But they were still going for something. They were still competing with each other. They were still going into that game, we're going to try and score enough points to get the scoring title. So I would suggest it's a little bit different. Like you said, Kobe Bryant, a comeback victory. Could he have possibly been pulled late in the game? Sure. But again, I think he earned the opportunity to challenge the record, to go for the 81 points after leading the Lakers back from that 18-point deficit. But I will say, and this may be my hot take for the episode, Derek, that some of the most impressive scoring performances aren't your 60, 70, 80-point games. Wilt's 100-point game, obviously. I look at something like Tracy McGrady's 13 points in 35 seconds. That huge clutch comeback, in the final minute there. I look at that as a more impressive scoring performance than padding stats to get your 60, 70, 80 points at the end of the game. At the end of a game.
Right, and that was against the Spurs, too. Right, yeah. That was against the Spurs, too. It's not against one of the worst teams in the league who are trying to lose, right? And in order to increase their, lottery odds and whatnot. That's and I mentioned that earlier. The Bird-Neek duel, neither of these players scored 50, right? But how impressive was that? Them going back and forth, that true competition. It was organic. It was awesome. It was real, right? There was no stat padding going on there. There are countless performances of 25, 30 points, etc. in regular season or playoff games that mean more, in my opinion, than this quote unquote record that Bam achieved. But then, it was also far more entertaining than that footage that I watched. I don't watch sport for stat padding. I don't watch sport for chucking. I don't watch sport for that stuff. You watch sport for true competition, for teams to go at it. It's also the same reason, Andrew, that you play sports.
Oh, yeah.
Right? When you play sports, you're playing to compete. So I don't want to see that. It's ridiculous. That, like I said, I wasn't exaggerating earlier when I said there are hundreds, maybe thousands, more important and more impressive performances than Bam's 83.
And hey, how about this? I would say that Michael Jordan's 40 points in the 1988 All-Star Game is more impressive than the 40-plus, 50-plus points that players have scored in the All-Star Game in the last 10 years when there's absolutely no defense, no effort. Actually having an opponent that is trying to compete, that is trying to stop you, trying to defend, actually matters. Once again, am I going to say this is the most disgraceful thing in the history of basketball, the history of the NBA? Not really. It's an inorganic performance. I don't really appreciate it. I don't really respect it. I'm not as impressed by it as other scoring efforts. There have certainly been incidents that are far more damaging to the league, far more unsporting. Brawls have really gotten out of control. Obviously, there's gambling scandals at the moment. That is a much bigger concern as far as the integrity of the league, to me, anyway. But I just can't appreciate a performance like this. Again, players have gone out of their way to score a lot of points before. People have also brought up David Robinson's 71-point game when he was going for the scoring title. Again, that's with a competitive goal in mind, so I look at it a little bit differently. Isn't necessarily the most selfless performance. Could you criticize it in some other way? Sure. But to me, it's just not the same as Bam's 83.
I also want to point out there was a comment on the NLSC Discord that stated, quote, Bam was just doing the most for no reason, end quote. followed by a random whose parents never told them to become more successful than they were. I can promise you that the majority of parents are not telling their kids to do what took place in this game or encouraging that in sport or in competition. What you saw in the NBA in this game was a circus, especially the way the fourth quarter played out. They're not telling their kid to disrespect the game and disrespect their opponents, etc. In fact, the opposite. So if your parent is saying that to you, if they're telling you to disrespect the game and disrespect your opponent, they're probably not doing a great job of parenting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny because I recently wrote an article about Will Chamberlain, his potential comebacks, which we also discussed on a recent show as well, Derek. And going back and looking through his stats later on in his career, it was interesting to see how many single-digit scoring performances he had when he could still score, but he was no longer in that big scoring role, even a 0-point game. And he is playing still his 48 minutes, or close to 48 minutes, and not taking any shots, or maybe one or two shots and not hitting them. Attitudes towards records were different back in the day. Obviously, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander just surpassed Will Chamberlain's 20-point game streak. And look, that is legitimate. He scored those points. We can talk about how he's foul baiting and whatnot, but he did score those points. He was scoring them in an effort to win games for the Thunder, the defending champions, obviously. But I don't think players cared as much about records back in the day. That's not to say they didn't care. Obviously, Wilt did go for the 100 points. He did care about his assist numbers when he really got into dishing out assists during the 1967 season. But players would let streaks come to an end. They didn't necessarily pad their stats to get to the 20 points to keep that streak going, or double digits to keep that streak going, or go for the triple-double. Look at Bob Sura and Ricky Davis when they tried to manufacture triple-doubles back in the day. That was something that was frowned upon. Now you have players trying to go for that triple-double. And it's not that they don't have the skill. It's not that it isn't impressive in its own way. But we are very obsessed with stats now and records, and very unique records. It's become a meme, Derek. Oh, he's the first player to have 35 points and 15 rebounds and 14 assists and 3 steals on a Monday wearing a blue jersey. The most obscure stats, the most obscure record you can think of. So that obsession with stats, and of course it goes into incentives with contracts, that doesn't help either. The fact they've had to change the rules about heaves at the buzzer to not affect shooting percentages because that's going to affect contract incentives. That's how ridiculous it's become with stats. So we've become very stat-obsessed in the discourse, and it's not healthy. And I think it leads to things like this.
Right, but I think it's more the NBA and the entertainment industry that is stat-obsessed and trying to project that on fans more than fans are stat-obsessed. I can be completely honest with you. There is this, especially with basketball. Right. We know that baseball has been historically more about stats. People pay more attention to that overall. But it seems like something that the NBA and the entertainment business and whatnot is trying to project onto fans in order to gain interest and whatnot. I also want to point out that I've already talked about SGA on a prior show. Absolutely hate the way he plays and whatnot. We're not going to get into that. But I also want to point out that this also isn't just coming at a current NBA player. So there's a few other NBA players today that put up just absolutely amazing performances in the past and sometimes the recent past. Steph Curry, absolutely ridiculous performances in the regular season and playoffs during true competition that blow away that band performance. LeBron James versus the Detroit Pistons in the playoffs, that ridiculous fourth quarter. That will always be 10 times better and 10 times more entertaining and 10 times more legit than a performance like this, or Devin Booker's 70. And Kawhi Leonard with the Raptors, just unbelievable in the playoffs. Monster performances, jaw-dropping skill on display on both ends of the floor. There's many current players who have just put up far better performances in games where it counted, where it mattered, where a team wasn't trying to lose, where there weren't all of these shenanigans, where there wasn't unbelievable chucking, etc. I want to bring up a quote real quick from Matt Bonner, who was on the Raptors when Kobe Bryant dropped 81 points. He states, when someone has a game like that, you want to think that they were on fire or they were in the zone. And with Bam, he was 7 for 22 from 3. If someone was 7 for 22 from 3, I'm closing out, sure. But I'm not like, this guy's a threat to break the second most points in a game. It's a fun story, but apples and oranges if you're comparing it to Kobe. When I think of the greatest performances in NBA history, that's what I picture, Kobe's 81. Not someone who shot 7 for 22 from 3, under 50% from the floor, and 42 free throws. He had the free throw count wrong. But also worth noting, again, that he was 10 for 27 after the first quarter, meaning 3/4 of the game was a poor performance overall. But Matt Bonner feels similar to us as it relates to this. Robert Ory, Andrew, stated, "To me, don't cheat the game. If you're going to play like that, that's cheating the game." And that was his comment about Bam's 83-point performance. Exactly. And I agree with him as well. Another quote that I thought you might enjoy is Gordon Hayward. He had a take on Bam's performance. He states, "I think Bam is one of the best two-way players in the league at his position, but he's not a scorer, right? So for him to break Kobe's record, I don't think it's great for the league. I think it kind of highlights how they're already struggling. It kind of feels like a pickup game when you're watching. And for him to shoot 43 free throws and 22 threes when that's not what he does, it almost feels like, and again, the Wizards too. With all these teams tanking, it kind of makes it feel not legit, I guess, is what I would say. And that's the thing, is you're playing against a team, Andrew, that is not even trying to win the basketball game. They're not even engaging in true competition. They want to throw this game. So he's calling it possibly not legit at all. So this overwhelmingly negative reaction, again, has a lot less to do with it being Bam and having everything to do with the context around the situation. A tanking team trying to lose, one of the worst defenses in the league, seldomly playing their starters late in games, chucking, not a strong shooting performance, throwing up air balls, the team the scorer is on, intentionally fouling a team while blowing them out, your own teammate intentionally missing a free throw so you can get another possession, etc. It is ridiculous. To me, that is a circus. To me, this is not a real scoring record.
And again, we can draw comparisons to Wilt's 100, which again, we can criticize for the late game shenanigans. You know, the fouling went on in that game. That's often been brought up in the past when that game is talked about. But Wilt did shoot a high percentage in that game. He was on fire in that game, to Matt Bonner's point. And Kobe obviously shooting a better percentage as well. You know, obviously, when you look at the box scores after some big scoring games, you realise, oh, this player did actually miss more shots than I thought, because they were hitting so many and ended up with so many points. But in the best high-scoring performances, players are still usually shooting a fairly high percentage. And it's funny because people have compared it to a video game performance, which it kind of is. That's where you see really inflated numbers, especially in my career, especially in my career, Derek, as you know. But it's funny because it's also a video game performance in the worst way as well, because we've all seen it. We've probably done it from time to time, Derek, just chucking shots on the virtual hardwood, you know, to get a high-scoring game. We end up scoring 60 points on 40 shots or 50 shots, you know, not a great percentage, not great efficiency. So it kind of resembles a video game in that way. I've told this story on the podcast before, I'm sure, Derek, but at the NBA Live 08 community event, they took us out to an event at a barbecue restaurant in New York there, and Gilbert Arenas was at the event. We were told, don't talk to him, don't bother him, this is just for the media, you know, we're just kind of here to be in the background. But we were watching Gilbert Arenas play NBA Live 08 using himself, and he scored about 70 points on 60 shots. So that's always been a funny memory to me. But to that point, it's that kind of video game performance, I think, Bam's 83, where he's not shooting the ball well, but does end up with 83 points, simply from the volume of shots, the volume of free throws, obviously. And the other thing I like about Gordon Hayward's comment is that Gordon Hayward is a modern player. You know, he only retired a few years ago, into the league in 2010. You can say, oh, Matt Bonner, old head, Robert Ory, even older head, you know, bitter old heads. You can push that narrative. Gordon Hayward was a contemporary of Bam Adebayo. You know, he is a modern player. So it's harder to push back when you have somebody who is younger, who has been in the league more recently. You know, you can't write him off, oh, bitter old head, complaining about how things were so much better back in the day. You know, maybe younger fans are going to be more inclined to listen to that. They should still listen to the older players as well, don't get me wrong. But I do kind of appreciate that we have a younger player, a player from this generation, speaking out against it as well.
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting, though, that many current players and I believe a couple current coaches were also pretty critical of this performance, including, Udoka, who, basically shot it down as not an impressive performance. Wemby shrugged it off, right? Even many current players and coaching staffs and whatnot were just like, this is ridiculous. A couple other interesting quotes from social media on this. Super 70 Sports stated, there are hundreds of guys in NBA history who could hang an 83 if they and their teammates were willing to make a complete mockery of basketball to do it. Washington should change their names to the Generals because all that was missing was buckets of confetti. Joke-ass league. And I completely agree with him. If Curry set out to chuck and he set out to score 80 plus against a tanking team and whatnot, he would have already done it that way. But he also probably has respect for the game and for himself, and he wouldn't do that. I think that there are countless players in NBA history, if they wanted to chuck and, for 3/4 of the game and have their teammates fouling the other team for him to get more possessions and whatnot, they could hang up those numbers. But I think that, the average player or the average star and whatnot wouldn't even think of doing something like that and in this way. And that's why I think we haven't seen it happen before. And I think this is another great point that somebody made. And this is on Twitter. It's at Ovo Lake Show. He states, hilarious that Kobe fans have to take the blame when the entire NBA world is dissecting Bam's night as a collective and calling its legitimacy into question. But because Kobe had the record, it's only his fan base that's complaining. Correct? Amazing narrative spin. And I completely agree with that. The majority of comments that I see about this that are negative, they're not even bringing up Kobe. Or if they do, it's more in passing, but it's more the general way the game was played, the way the stats were achieved, the way that it wasn't truly an impressive performance at all after the first quarter, the shenanigans in the fourth quarter. That's the stuff that's being brought up. It's not about it being Bam, and it's not even about it beating Kobe's 81. It's the way the performance happened.
And we have seen a shift in those attitudes. Like I said, you go back and look at the game logs from Wilt's career, later on in his career anyway, and you do see that he's not caring about scoring as much. He is having these single-digit scoring games. Obviously wasn't concerned about keeping a streak going or always scoring at least 10 points for 1,000 games in a row or whatever. I remember a Bulls game from the 1998 season, the last dance, of course, against the Clippers, where MJ had 49 points, his season high that year. Obviously not his career high, but towards the end of the game, the Bulls got the win in the bag, and the crowd, a Clippers crowd, is basically begging him to shoot one more time to get the 50 points. But the game is decided. MJ just decides, no, I'm just going to dribble it out. I'm not going to go for 50 points here. And it's not like Michael Jordan turned down opportunities to score. It's not like MJ was not concerned about scoring, didn't go for scoring titles, etc. But even he would pass up an opportunity like that to pad stats because the game was over. And the game was much closer than the Heat-Wizards game. So attitudes have definitely changed about stat padding.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up a few more quotes from social media that I thought were very interesting. So Glenn Ordway stated, I just watched that game. Tom is 100% correct. And he's talking about Tom Haberstroh, who had a similar take to this. He stated, Bam's 83-point game was totally manipulated and not part of a normal game. Rick Kamla, who you remember from NBA TV, used to be on that all the time. He states, this is all you need to know about Bam Adebayo's 83-point game. And he put a bunch of asterisks after it. He stated, the Lakers led 91-85 heading into the fourth quarter against Toronto and won by 18. Kobe's 81 was pure and legit. He continues, Bam's 83 was artificial, fraudulent, hypocritical, and a complete indictment of Heat culture. CJ Wilson states, it's literal NBA coaches and players saying the same thing, but somehow we are the haters. And then finally, Tim McMahon goes off and states, he's jacking up threes triple teamed. It was honestly just awful, hideous, disgusting basketball down the stretch. I never, ever want to hear about Heat culture and professionalism and all that crap again, because that was the most blatant stat chasing I've ever seen. It was embarrassing for the Wizards and egregious for the Heat. I enjoyed the ethical 39 by Wemby more than I did the egregious 83. And again, like we stated, 39, a legit 39 without the stat chasing, without the stat padding during true competition. Andrew, that's way more entertaining and way more legit.
Oh, absolutely. And haters has become such an overused term. I hate the term haters these days. I understand pushing back on actual hating and actual toxic negativity, but there's so much toxic positivity in fandoms these days. This, you can't criticize anything. We've seen it in basketball gaming discourse, Derek, and pretty much any kind of online content creation. Oh, you can't criticize at all. You're just a hater. And it's such a lazy argument when you can back up your points, when you have valid feelings about a certain situation, when you have valid criticisms that you can back up with rationale, with reason. Yeah, it's ridiculous how so much valid criticism and thought experiments are dismissed under the umbrella of hating.
I think this is one of my favorite takes, and I know you'll like this one. Ashley Nicole Moss states, this is actually interesting. On this app, there's constantly a conversation about people, quote, not caring about basketball, end quote, and just caring about the hot takes. But last night, people had a legitimate issue about the integrity of basketball and officiating and were called haters. Funny how that works, right? Maybe people don't care as much about the hot takes and they really care about what's happening on the basketball court and if it's a legitimate on-court product.
There you go. Yeah. Before we go on, a reminder that the NLSC podcast comes out every week on the NLSC, NBA-live.com, as well as our YouTube channel. We're also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast apps. If you're listening on any of those apps, we'd greatly appreciate a review. To keep up with the show and everything we're doing with basketball gaming in general, connect with us on social media. On Twitter and Facebook, we are the NLSC. We also have an Instagram, NLSC Basketball, and on YouTube, we're youtube.com/NBA Live Series Center. Once again, visit us at nba-live.com, where in addition to the podcast, you'll also find all of our original content, as well as our forum and modding community.
And I wanted to bring up a few more before we get to community responses to this related to this performance. There were a few people that were making some ridiculous statements. One of them, Brian Fonseca, he states, basketball fans don't actually like basketball anymore. They just want to defend the legacy of their favorite players. It's lame as shit. So what he's stating is that people that were criticizing the way Bam Adebayo scored 83 points don't actually like basketball. It's the opposite. They want to see real basketball, and that's why it's getting criticized. Another absolutely ridiculous statement. Jim Rome states, I'm a Kobe guy, but if you have a problem with Bam Adebayo putting in 83, you have a problem with yourself. I don't think that's how it works, Andrew.
Nah.
What an absolutely ridiculous
ad hominem
statement.
Yep.
Yeah. Colin Cowherd states, the minute there's success, we've got to tear somebody down. 83 is 83. There's that whole thing I hate. It was totally legitimate. He doesn't make any points in this that are relevant. He's just basically stating you're a hater if you criticize the fact that Bam scored 83. Drew Hanlon, who has some absolutely terrible takes on Twitter, states, regardless what you think of Bam's 83 points, it's 83 points in an NBA game. A lot of y'all couldn't score 83 points in a middle school game.
Ad hominem.
So, yeah, it's just, again, it's stating, okay, you're criticizing this, you must be a non-athlete, right? You must not be good at sports. You must not know anything about the game if you're saying anything poor about this 83-point NBA game. Just ridiculous. But I could go on and on. The response to the negativity about Bam's 83-point performance was mostly just that. 83 is 83. If you're not impressed by this 83-point performance, you don't even like basketball. You must not be a fan of the game, all of that stuff. You don't even like the NBA. How ridiculous. Disregarding all of the context, all of the true talking points related to how those 83 points were scored. Just ridiculous stuff, in my opinion, Andrew, and sad to see.
How dare you criticize this movie? Have you ever made a movie or a TV show or written a book? You can't criticize art. You're no artist. You're no author. It's the same argument, the same energy, basically. And it's ridiculous because they're talking about tearing people down. And these are some of the people that constantly tear down the past to prop up the now. You could easily say, people aren't fans these days. They just want to tear down the past to feel like the present is the best, so that they feel like they're witnessing the best product, that they can say, oh, my generation is the best generation. You can easily turn that argument around, that ad hominem argument around. So yeah, it's utterly ridiculous. It's toxic positivity. It's completely dismissing valid criticisms. If you want to argue in favor of it, that's fine, but bring an actual argument. Leave the ad hominems to discussion boards in the 2000s. Leave it to the kids on social media. You are supposedly a journalist. You are supposedly an analyst who knows something. Well, they're not. They're hot take artists. We know that. But if you are supposedly this expert, this analyst, come with an actual argument, because the people who have criticisms, they are.
Yeah, Andrew, I like real basketball. I like sport. I like competition, which is why I am incredibly critical of this game and this performance. I care about the integrity of the game and whatnot. It's the exact opposite of what many of these media members are trying to state. If you like real basketball, you didn't like what you saw in that performance. But let's get to the community responses to this week's community question. I asked, what are your thoughts on Bam Adebayo's 83-point game? Uninspired stat chasing against a tanking team, not legit? Or I don't like how he got to 83, but it's legit? Or great performance, unstoppable and legit, good for the game? So T Gentry at Bucky_T states, his stat line wasn't impressive to me as the late Kobe's 81-point game was. Bam shot nearly 40 free throws and went up against one of the worst teams. Also, seeing how it's a lot of stat chasing these days, believe me when I say that someone will break that 83-point record soon. I mean, if they do, it's going to take a certain personality, and it's going to take somebody chucking. And more than likely, if you see it, it's not going to be executed in the confines of real competition. If it is, that will be legit, and I'll be singing its praises. The last time that we've seen it completed in true competition was probably Kobe's 81. Was it against a good team? No, but it was praised heavily at the time because, again, the Lakers had to make a comeback. I think with like 7 minutes to go in the fourth quarter, it was like 97-93, and the Raptors were still in it, and Kobe was shooting an incredibly high percentage, and he was unstoppable, and he was incredibly impressive. So the last time that we saw this was, over 20 years ago. So yeah, I don't know if we'll see it again anytime soon.
And of course, the Lakers were kind of mediocre that year as well. And yeah, even though the Raptors were a weak team, they're still NBA competition. They were still up in that game. They were still beating the Lakers. They still necessitated that comeback that Kobe led with his 81 points. So again, like we said, context is everything.
Leader of the Foot Clan at AK_Chuck_Cross states, getting 83 points anywhere is an incredible feat, so congratulations to Bam, but shooting 40-plus free throws is ridiculous. Steven at the Live King states, NBA only cares about headlines. Devin Booker stat padded his 70-point game, too. We mentioned that earlier in the show. NBA is trying hard to break records nowadays. It's all for spectacle. And you actually alluded to that in your take about the 83-point game in the current state of the NBA.
Yeah, it does feel like they want to establish the modern era as the best. Be able to point to these numbers and say, oh, the numbers have never been higher. Look at all these players averaging triple-doubles or close to it. Look at these 60 and 70-point games, etc. But when you don't have the same defensive effort, when it's manufactured, it's very false. It's very contrived. It's not as enjoyable. It's not as impressive. And people can say, oh, the numbers are what matter at the end of the day. The context doesn't matter. But again, over 60 years later, people are pointing out, oh, we don't have footage of Wilt's game. Oh, Wilt was being fouled heavily in the final minutes. His team was fouling to get him the ball back. So I disagree that people aren't going to remember the context, because people are bringing up the context about Wilt's game over 6 decades later.
Mike P for 3 at Mike Parchard states, I was fine with the first 3 quarters, but the fourth was a joke. Garva at Garva_23 states, not as inspiring as Kobe's, yet 83 is 83. And that's where we completely disagree. It is 83 points, but without context, it's just a number. Neon and Butch Gaming at Stildo33, friend of the show. We've had him on a couple times, and I just kicked his butt in a game of NBA 2K19. States it was stupid. He had a great game and earned some points. But when you start fouling the other team to stop the clock up 25 so you can chase stats, that's disrespectful and embarrassing to the game. He had 70 points up 22 with 9 minutes to go. He should have come out. Stasho Bro at Nate Stasho, Live 01 legend, states, it reminded me of Roger Ward stat chasing, the other Live 01 legend. He's always trying to juice up his player of the game stat lines. I can see this same strategy happening again with a player going for 84 points in the next 3 to 5 years. Also, it reminded me of David Robinson's 70-point stat chasing game. And yes, in that game, David Robinson, he was trying to lead the league in scoring over Shaq, and he did succeed.
And I think you can criticize that as being kind of a selfish goal, I suppose. But again, there is a competitive goal there, so I don't mind David Robinson's 71 points as much. He decided, I'm going to have a big scoring game. He had the opportunity to score 71. I don't see it as quite the same, but you certainly can criticize it as being a little bit selfish.
And lastly, on Twitter, Royce at RoyceBrink14 states, 83 is 83, but the fouling to get extra possessions and other things the Heat did in the game, he's alluded to that being a negative. Also is against the Wizards, which makes it off-putting. None of this should matter, but sadly it does in today's NBA. Were the Heat stat chasing? Oh my God, yes. Sadly, this is the current NBA. Stat chasing, foul lining, and foul baiting up the wazoo. The 43 free throws are also something that make this off-putting. Also, feeding him the ball where he had 3 or 4 players on him was just chasing the record. He continues, I understand wanting it for your teammate, but it just looked and seemed just so stage managed, to use a Humphrey Bogart term. Also, doing it while up over 20 points was also stage managed. Finally, he states, also the George Gervin and David Thompson scoring duel for the league scoring title was totally different. So all this talk about this being close to that is way, way wrong. That was a different time and a different game. So respect to Gervin, Thompson, Kobe, Wilt, Jordan, and everyone else. So Royce, yeah, he's not feeling that performance either.
And I brought that up as well, the scoring battle between Gervin and Thompson. And again, I think context is important. I think that is different. Is it kind of selfish to be going for the scoring title as opposed to focusing on winning a championship? Sure, but not every team does have a chance to win. You are still competing. You are still trying to win that game. You just also have that personal goal as well. They were battling for the scoring title, so they both went for that big scoring game in the final game of the season. I think that's fine. Again, you have no tanking. You don't have any kind of chicanery. You don't have any kind of manufactured stats there. That's just 2 great scorers deciding, we both want the scoring title. We're going to battle it out on the last day of the season.
Moving over to Discord, Shamgod states, great performance, unstoppable and legit. Good for the game. And Juicy Shack Meat states, just to rephrase what I posted earlier this week, I was only surprised it wasn't a kind of player most known for shooting threes that broke Kobe's record, as I was confident it was inevitable with the modern NBA style of play. Too much stat inflation anyway, all around the league these days. I also can't really hate on how Bam reached 83. To sum up what other Discord members shared, Wilt Chamberlain reached 100 in a similar way, which arguably isn't an ethical approach. When Kobe's 81 happened, at the time I clearly remember it intensified his ball-hogging reputation. But from a general public consciousness point of view, all of that context gets lost over time, and we only remember the actual achievement. I think Bam's 83 points will be treated the same. And that's where we disagree again. There isn't a 2 wrongs make a right thing, right? If the similar thing or the same thing happened in Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game, it's not going to be exactly the same, but some of the behaviors and whatnot, then that also puts that performance in question. I think throwing up your hands, I'm not saying this is what he's doing, but throwing up your hands and saying, this is just the way it is, or this is how it's happened before, doesn't speak to the true context of a situation. It doesn't speak to a greater problem. And we all know what the problems are with the current NBA, with the stat chasing, with the stat inflation, with the lack of competition, with so many teams tanking and everything. And it's important to have those conversations. And it's important to dissect, quote, performances, end quote, like this, because it can speak to a bigger problem.
Yeah, and once again, people do bring up the context of Wilt making over the finish line to the 100 points over 60 years later. So the context hasn't been forgotten. It's often brought up to put Wilt's 100 in context, or downplay it, as the case may be, or at least to criticize it. So I don't agree that the context will be lost. I think it's always going to be brought up because people who watched the game and saw how it went down and know basketball are going to bring it up, just as they bring it up about Wilt's game, again, over 6 decades later. You know, you look at Michael Jordan's run of triple-doubles in the 1989 season. He was definitely trying for triple-doubles at that time. That's been documented. And of course, I do think it proves that Michael Jordan could be that all-around player if that's the role he played, if he wanted to be. But people have also criticized that for him trying to go for triple-doubles and becoming obsessed with triple-doubles. So this criticism has been levied at players throughout the decades, and, you know, it's not unreasonable to analyze these performances and look at both sides of the coin.
I agree with you. I don't think context is going to be lost as it relates to Bam's performance. I think for the super casual fan who's just looking up on Google, you know, what are the highest scoring games in NBA history, and then they see Bam's 83, and they're like, oh, he must be one of the greatest players of all time, and then maybe they don't look into it further, then there's going to be no context there, right? They're just going to think Bam was this amazing player and amazing scorer. But for the majority of people who are either around for it or look it up and look at the performance and everything, and then, you know, look up a video of it, etc., then it's all going to come full circle, and it's going to be like, well, this is kind of ridiculous. This isn't impressive. The Wizards were terrible. They weren't trying. You know, the Heat were fouling, you know, in order to get Bam more possessions, all of that stuff. So I don't think that in the grand scheme of things that context will be lost related to this performance. Like you mentioned, people still talk about the Wilt thing. They talk about how the 100 points could have been scored or were scored, etc. There's no footage of it, but that conversation is pretty consistent.
So we also received a couple of other responses on other social media platforms, on Threads. Bozic Borna had a green response, that is great performance, unstoppable and legit, good for the game, as did D-Rent 2001. Jumping over to Facebook, we also had a few more people respond green. Young, Duron, and Keelan all responded with a green circle. Once again, great performance, unstoppable and legit, good for the game. Cameron says between green and yellow, so kind of on the fence between not really loving it but also thinking it is legit. Renell says, I dig it. Every normal starter but Bam were in street clothes, so Bam took it upon himself to be extra assertive. The issue is Washington couldn't stop him. But were they trying, Derek?
Yeah, we've already talked about it at length in this show. They were trying to lose the game. They were not playing their most important players, especially down the stretch. They had many suspect fouls on Bam that didn't make any sense, some that were pretty far away from the basket. Also, he had a really, really strong, impressive first quarter, but as I stated prior, the last 3 quarters were an absolute circus and not a strong performance. We were talking 10 for 27 from the floor, well below league average, from field goal range, and then, he was chucking from 3, and for the game he was 7 for 22, once again well below league average, and then the ridiculous fouls and going to the line. So no, I don't agree.
And we have some yellow responses. That is, I don't like how he got to 83, but it's legit. Those responses come from Gilbert, or Gilbert, who also adds Kobe in his comment. Jamel also says yellow. Darren responds with yellow. I'm a Celtics fan. I'm just waiting for the next big news to drop so we can stop talking about it at this point. Brad is another yellow response, says it counts. Sadly, sometimes stats count, which aren't exactly the best. Westbrook having plays leave rebounds for him, ignoring defense to get rebounds. Sadly, this is the price to pay for having stat tracking of all-time highs, etc., and how fame and fortune come from stats. And that goes back to a point that we brought up, Derek, that, yeah, the league is so obsessed with stats and manufacturing legacy that fans are being told to care about big numbers, regardless of context.
No, the funny thing is, and I've talked about this on prior episodes, the stats in so many ways are still far inferior to what we've even seen in the past. Things like steal totals for a single season, block totals for a single season, some of the ridiculous rebound seasons that were happening in, the 70s and 80s and 60s and whatnot. There's still so many single season stats and stats in general that pale in comparison nowadays, in comparison to the past. So they're trying hard, but they still can't beat so many of the stats from the past.
Antonio isn't a fan, says crappy AF. Chris says, it counts, I don't care, I won't remember this in a few years, which you may not, but I think a lot of people will. I think people will bring it up, and once again, Derek, the context will definitely be brought up, because people are still bringing up context of stats and achievements from years ago.
Yeah, he also states, who cares? I don't know, people that care about the integrity of the game and, true sport and true competition and how records happen and, were they legitimate? Is it good for basketball? All of that stuff. So, yeah, I care about basketball, and I care about how basketball is perceived and looked at. I care about, how it's represented on TV. I care about how it's being taken in by our youth, how they're learning about it and learning it, all of that. So, I do care, and I think you care as well.
And another Derek says it was given to him. Tristan says, red, not impressive, it's only stat padding. Ricky says, why didn't the highly paid Wizards players try and ruin his night? Bam was probably the only threat on the court for them. Great and unexpected coming from Bam. And I guess that's why a lot of people do enjoy it, because it is such an unexpected player to get it. But again, Ricky, the Wizards were tanking. They're not trying to put any kind of effort in at the moment.
Even Spoelstra said that. Spoelstra said it in, an interview after the game. He goes, we knew they were trying to lose. If that isn't crap, what is? Andrew. So, they're not even trying to win the game. It's ridiculous.
And Joshua says, I don't agree with people saying it doesn't count because it was mostly free throws. Did people say that when SGA broke Will Chamberlain's 20-plus points in a game record? No. There is no rule that says free throws don't count as points. No matter how you score 83, it counts. And Moises responds to that saying, SGA broke the record in a close and competitive game against the Celtics, and he only shot 8 free throws compared to Bam's, where his teammates were intentionally fouling their opponent while up by 20, just so Bam can score and catch up LMAO. And yeah, that is the difference. That is the context that we're talking about.
Yeah. I also want to point out that SGA is frequently criticized by media and fans alike based on his style of play and the foul baiting and the head jerking and, and the favorable treatment he gets by the officials. So him saying that, that doesn't factor in or it's not been brought up related to his streak or his scoring and everything, I don't agree with that either.
And finally, Jared says, I don't get the hate people have for it. The Wizards are trying to lose games, the Heat wanted to make history, it's not the players' fault that it happened that way. You can probably put an asterisk on every 70-plus point scoring effort if you really wanted to, so no idea why Bam's is the one everyone fixates on. The only thing that surprised me is how ridiculous it made his work-in-progress NBA Showdown card. The guy goes from a decent defensive weapon with average point output to a guy that can get hot and drop 80 on you if he wanted. But to that point, we certainly would put an asterisk on the stat padding performances, the ones that came about very inorganically. So, yeah, people do point that out, Jared.
Yeah, he got hot for one quarter and then shot incredibly poorly for 3 quarters. I don't understand why that context is missing here. He did not 3 quarters of the game was a poor performance shooting the ball. Wildly poor, well below league average for, shooting from the field and shooting from 3. That was chucking. And then the rest of it was free throws. So I just don't understand why that's being missed here. I don't know if it's people don't know that he didn't shoot well, for the last 3 quarters or that it was incredibly poor, etc. I don't know if they're just looking at the overall numbers, which outside of free throws, again, under 50% from the field and 7 for 22 from 3. It was a large amount of chucking, inefficient chucking against a team trying to lose a basketball game.
I guess if I can play devil's advocate for a moment, people enjoy witnessing history. They enjoy seeing something out of the ordinary. But to me, and to you, and to a lot of us who are criticizing this, or at least are not as impressed by it, once again, the context matters. The way it happens does matter, because a big scoring night is so much more impressive if the defense is tough, if the players really have to work for it, if the player has shot really well, to Matt Bonner's point, if it feels like they're on fire. So yeah, not to belabor a point, but that context is important. But at the same time, I do understand if you are just excited to see something out of the ordinary. Yeah, I can kind of see that.
I also hope the community appreciates the fact that we don't always agree with them. Right, like we're going to be honest on this show, and I disagree with many of the points that were made, especially on Facebook and threads and whatnot about well, it's 83 is 83, or it was great performance, all of that stuff. But we're not going to sugarcoat it, and we appreciate the fact that you're interacting with the community questions and in the show, and we hope you listen in and whatnot. But yeah, we're going to be honest, just like you're being honest with your takes.
Absolutely, and we can disagree on these things. And to your point, that is their honest take. We've given our honest take. We're not going to talk down to you about it, but we will defend our point of view and respectfully disagree.
So thank you to everybody that responded to the community question. A lot of engagement. We hope you appreciate our take on this as well, whether you agree with it or not. And let's hope for basketball to, at some point, enter a better state.
Absolutely. With that being said, that has brought us to the end of this week's show. As always, thank you for tuning in, and a reminder that you can catch us every week on the NLSC, our YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Also, both we and the NLSC are on social media, and we'd appreciate a follow. So Derek, go ahead and plug the handles.
Yeah, you can reach me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at D43G and at D4384. I'm also on the NLSC, D43, and on YouTube, D43.
As for me, I'm Andrew in the forum and Andrew NLSC on X and Blue Sky. The NLSC is on X, Facebook, and Blue Sky at the NLSC. We're also NLSC Basketball on Instagram and Threads. We're on YouTube at NBA Live Series Center. And of course, keep it locked to the NLSC itself, nba-live.com, for all things basketball gaming. So, thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Derek.
Go get buckets, everyone!